Okay, so thank you all for coming, and I'm going to turn this presentation over to Dr. Hettie Williams to speak about the Georgia of the North, Black women and the Civil Rights Movement in New Jersey.
Okay.
Questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will be okay. All right. Okay, so my presentation is really based on my book called The Georgia of the North, Black Women in the Civil Rights Movement in New Jersey. And the core argument of my book is essentially that the civil rights movement had its origins in New Jersey. So that's what I will talk to you, talk with you about tonight. And so there's really four things that I organize this presentation around: the concept of the personal as political, and why the civil rights movement as a whole was a women's movement, not only in the North in states like New Jersey, but also in the South. And so this idea of the personal as political is an idea that comes from a 1969 essay written by Carol Hanisch. And it basically comes out of the women's rights movement to suggest that things that we might feel or believe are personal issues that impact our daily lives impact more than just one woman at a time. For instance, domestic violence, sexual harassment, and or assault. That these are widespread issues that impact, a percentage of women is a part of a larger structural problem that is a manifestation of patriarchy. And so that idea of the personal as political became sort of a rallying cry by feminists in the late 1960s, as drawn from this essay. And I also want to talk a little bit about the history of the civil rights movement. So what historians call historiography, and then my case study of Black women in New Jersey. And then I'll end and talk a little bit about some of the local archives that I use to put this book together. And so the personal as political, I became interested in talking about the civil rights movement or studying the civil rights movement basically from my mother's story. On the left, you see my maternal grandmother, Bonsil Hill. And my mother grew up in Southwest Georgia in a little town called Albany, Georgia. And my grandmother always worked from the home. And so I was always the kid with a lot of questions and always asking my mom different questions about history, about family history. And one day I did ask my mother why, why does grandma always work at home? Why does she work in the home? My mother was a nurse, an LPN for 35 years, and so she worked outside of the home. So I was trying to figure this out in my, 5-year-old head, trying to ask my mom these questions. And she eventually told me, after pestering her for several years, that the reason that my grandmother worked in the home is because my grandfather, Willie Frank Hill, her father, was afraid that my grandmother might get assaulted if she worked as a domestic in the homes of white people in the South. Now, this is Georgia, right? It's Georgia in the early 20th century. So that was a common occurrence according to historians of women's history, that Black women were assaulted on a regular basis, many of whom worked in the homes of white men across the South. And so that's the answer my mother eventually told me about why my grandmother worked from home. On the right, you see the famed civil rights activist who was a member of the SNCC and formed the SNCC Freedom Singers, Bernice Johnson Reagan. The Freedom Singers were formed essentially in my mother's hometown, Albany, Georgia. And my mom's family was heavily involved in the civil rights movement in the South. She eventually would marry my father in the 60s, join that second phase of the Great Migration, and migrate north and settle in New Jersey. And so I grew up with these stories from my parents about the 1960s, the civil rights movement, and this fear, this personal fear that my grandfather had about my grandmother potentially being assaulted. And so she worked from the home. Bernice Johnson Reagan is a famed civil rights activist, as I said, who is related to my grandfather, Willie Frank Hill. They were cousins. And she is the one who encouraged my grandfather and his children to get involved in the civil rights movement in Albany when Martin Luther King came to Albany, Georgia in 1961. And so I often share this photo of my mother here, Gloria, in the poodle skirt. The personal is political, right? The fear that one could be assaulted by working in the homes of white people across the South, right? As a cook, a domestic, right? This fear that this happened, regularly across the South in the early 20th century. To the right, you see an image of a man here by the name of Sam Wells. Sam Wells was the leader of the Albany movement when King came to Albany, Georgia, my mother's hometown. On the left here, you see my mother standing in front of Holly High School and ready to march. I always call that her marching photo because she gets directly involved in the Albany movement at the encouragement of Reagan to her cousin, my grandfather, Willie Frank Hill. And so the entire family got involved in the civil rights movement. My mom's from a very large family. She has seven sisters, and there's 14 of them. So she's had many siblings who were also involved in the civil rights movement, along with my grandfather, who was very active in the movement as well. I interviewed Sam Wells when I did my master's thesis many years ago on the same topic of the civil rights movement. Focus of that project was the civil rights movement in the South. The point of my presentation really is the civil rights movement happened obviously everywhere across the country, not just in the South, but in the North as well. And the Georgia of the North kind of makes the argument that it has roots in the Garden State. And so I grew up with these stories about the civil rights movement as told to me from my grandparents, my grandfather in particular, my mother right here, who marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in 1961. This is an image of my mother at the time. She was only 18 years old. This is a photo of her on the left. She's about 19 years old in this photo. And to the right, you see three of her sisters, my aunts, who were also active in the civil rights movement. And the reason I start this presentation with the personal as political, these personal stories of women who grew up in the South, fearing that they might be assaulted, right, tells us that women had a compelling reason to start a civil rights movement because the attacks that were happening to these women in the homes of white men, right, made it a compelling reason to start a civil rights movement. And so many historians have written about the fact that women played a vital role in the civil rights movement. We know many of these famous women, like Rosa Parks. Okay, we all know her story. Claudette Colvin, right? Teenagers. My aunts at the time were teenagers. They were 13, 14 years old. My mother was the oldest daughter. She was 18 at the time that she got involved in the civil rights movement in Albany, Georgia. So women played an integral role in the civil rights movement. Women were leaders like Ella Baker. We know many of these women who now are famous in history. and ordinary women like my mother and her sisters and my grandmother. And so I grew up with these stories about the civil rights movement, mainly focused on the South, because that's where my mother was active and that's where she grew up, right? So the personal as political. But historians have written about, so this is the historiography part, the next part of this presentation. Historians have talked about the fact that African Americans have always struggled against racism long before the traditional civil rights movement began in the 1950s. And it has led historians to talk about the struggle for Black equality, the ongoing struggle against racism. Okay, so Harvard Sitkoff's book in the 1980s, The Struggle for Black Equality. So this phrase often gets used, the struggle for Black equality, that knows no boundaries. It doesn't just happen in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, right? That African Americans are always struggling for freedom and as a result, making the country more democratic. It's African Americans who call the nation to conscience over slavery, over civil rights, and now currently over the carceral state. And so there's a constant struggle that's etched into Black identity, right? A famous song of Bernice Johnson Reagan, who I just showed you a picture of, was a famous line from that song is "We who believe in freedom cannot rest." Okay, Ella's song, a song in tribute to Ella Baker, one of the great leaders of the civil rights movement. The history of history then tells us that African Americans have always struggled for freedom, for equal rights. But this struggle did not only, involve well-known people like Rosa Parks or Ella Baker. It involved ordinary people like my mother and her sisters and my grandfather who were organizing at the ground level. And so Charles Payne's book in 1995, I've Got the Light of Freedom, the organizing tradition and the Mississippi freedom struggle is about a tradition of organizing. So there's a tradition of struggle that goes hand in hand with the tradition of organizing. Organizing associations, clubs, and societies to fight against racism. So that too has a long history. The struggle for Black equality and the organizing tradition, which have always happened across the entire nation, not just in the South, right? So that's a part of the history of history. How does this organizing tradition show up? And what role do Black women play in this organizing tradition? Black women in the Black church, as many historians have shown, played an important role, played an important role raising money for civil rights campaigns. So women are at the center of this organizing tradition and the larger struggle for Black equality. Uh, so famously, when Kamala Harris ran for president, we know her story and her background, right? She went to HBCU, historically Black college and university, and she was a member of a historically Black sorority. And she gave a famous speech in July of 2024 at their one of their events, their convention. And so the reason I show this image is to show you that women are at the center of the organizing tradition through the church, through historically Black colleges, through sororities and other associations. Okay. So, in other words, there's this organizing tradition in which Black women are at the center of. And it makes a lot of sense that a woman who's directly tied to this organizing tradition of Black women would be right catapulted to this position as, you know, eventually as a vice president. Okay, so that tradition is long, it's deep, it's vast, and it's everywhere across the nation that African Americans built churches and schools, associations, and organizations to fight for equality, like access to education, for instance, which is central to the demand for Black freedom rights. Okay, so that image is just an example. When Harris ran for president, the hashtag Win with Black Women began to circulate, and the Black organizing tradition was once again galvanized, where Black women across the country began to organize and help, the Harris campaign. So again, there's a very strong tradition of organizing. Okay, that's just examples of this idea of the organizing tradition. So Black women are at the center of it. The organizing tradition is what galvanized the civil rights movement, and Black women have a vested interest in starting a civil rights movement because of the wide-scale assault on their bodies, the personal as political, the historiography of this event, right? Involving an organizing tradition of Black women and men, but women in particular are at the center of this tradition by the time we get to the civil rights movement, the more traditional chronology of the civil rights movement. Now, many historians have written about the role of Black women. Okay. Fannie Lou Hamer, many of you, I'm sure, know this name too, who was a poor working class woman in Mississippi who helped organize, once again, the organizing tradition at the grassroots level, right? Got involved with SNCC, gives a famous speech when the Democratic Convention is in New Jersey, right? So China Kylie's For Freedom's Sake, The Life of Fannie Lou Hamer talks about Hamer's work in this larger civil rights movement and tradition, okay? And that book came out in 1999. At the Dark End of the Street, Daniel McGuire's book really, talks about some of the more important women of the movement, like Rosa Parks. But at the dark end of the street, Black women rape resistance, a new history of the civil rights movement, from Rosa Parks to the rise of Black power. What McGuire does in this book is she reveals why the civil rights movement was a woman's movement, right? It was a movement to demand not only civil rights, but bodily integrity, in which these women were demanding because of the wide-scale sexual assault of Black women across the South. They had a compelling reason to lead a civil rights movement, right? And we know on the ground in Montgomery that it's Black women who were organizing at the grassroots level, the Montgomery Improvement Association, and even before that, the Women's Political Council was organizing, right? Before King even came to town. And this is what McGuire talks about in her book. They organized to defend Recy Taylor, who was assaulted, right, by several white men. And McGuire reveals that the NAACP sends one of its most sophisticated investigators to, right, the South to investigate what happened to Recy Taylor. And if you read the book, you know who that woman was. It was Rosa Parks. And that was in the 1940s, the early 1940s. So women have this vested interest in starting a civil rights movement in both the South and the North, right? Other historians have written about this notion of the deep North. Many of you listening tonight have heard of the phrase the deep South. And you say, okay, racism, deep South, Alabama, Georgia, right? But historians writing about the civil rights movement in the North have used the phrase the deep North. Racism, right? Deeply embedded in the North as well. So in 2019, The Strange Careers of the Jim Crow North is one book, very important book, right? that talks about civil rights movement in the North. Important historians like Jean Theo and Kamosi Woodard have written a great deal about the civil rights movement in the North. My work builds on the work that has been done by many other historians. And then Sweet Land of Liberties, the forgotten struggle for civil rights in the North. So, very recently, in the last 2 decades, historians have begun to look at the civil rights movement in the North. So that's the history of the history, right? States like New York, there are books about obviously the civil rights movement in New York and Philadelphia, and vast array of historians writing about these different cities. And now New Jersey has become a big focus as well. And Betty Livingston Adams' book, Black Women's Christian Activism Seeking the Social Justice in a Northern Suburb, talks about Black women and their organizing in northern New Jersey out of the Black church movement. Okay. And people like Florence Spearing Randolph figure prominently in her book. And that's really the first major book written by a historian and a scholar about Black women and the civil rights movement in New Jersey. So it's a very important book that those of you who are interested in this topic should read. And my book then is building on this scholarship about struggle for Black equality, organizing tradition, the centrality of the role of women. Georgia of the North, Black Women in the Civil Rights Movement in New Jersey focuses solely on New Jersey and building on that argument that Black women, like Florence Spearing Randolph on the right, part of the Black women's club movement and church movement. These women were involved in the suffrage movement, advocating for the access to the right to vote. New Jersey Federation of Colored Women's Clubs were organizing, uh, demanding the right to vote for women, but also making, demands for civil rights and access to public spaces and education. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham talks about the activism of women in the Black church, like Florence Spearing Randolph, who I briefly discuss in my book at the beginning. Betty Livingston Adams does an extensive work on Florence Spearing Randolph in northern New Jersey, trying to advocate for equal rights and access to voting. What I do in the Georgia of the North is I look at women in different parts of the state, in the northern part of the state, the southern part of the state, like Sarah Spencer Washington. The book begins with a discussion of the Great Migration. You know, historians have argued that the first response to freedom for African Americans when emancipation came was migration, to move out of the South northward during what became known as the Great Migration. So the first part of the book talks about the Great Migration to New Jersey and the fact that New Jersey had always had a very large Black population in the colonial era. So we know, those of you who are really good with New Jersey history, you know that there were several towns already established and different sections of the state, Lawnside, right? And parts of Fairhaven, New Jersey, that enclaves and towns, Timbuktu. We know we are familiar with all these towns, right? And that there was already a fairly large Black population in New Jersey. So why would so many people migrate? Sarah Spencer Washington migrates from the South to New Jersey, looking for opportunity, looking to escape a very real system of Jim Crow and looking for opportunity, right? She eventually becomes one of America's earliest millionaires in the hair care industry. She establishes Apex hair care business in the second decade of the 20th century. Apex Beauty becomes a global business. She has thousands of workers. Women are training and learning this apex system, which is what she called it. A parallel to what Spencer does is Madam C.J. Walker. Everybody knows Madam C.J. Walker. Some of you might know Annie Malone. So there are several black women who look to the hair care industry to establish their wealth and their power. So Sarah Spencer, as far as I'm aware, was the first black woman to own a factory in New Jersey, and she settled in Atlantic City, right? She comes up in a few different books she's written about because she becomes very wealthy, a philanthropist in Atlantic City, and establishes this global business. But she's also active in the organizing tradition. She's a member of the National Association of Colored Women. She's a, a member of the NAACP, active in the Black Republican clubs at the time. She is also a philanthropist, okay? Gives her money to different charities and establishes a rest home. She has a golf court and, of course, and also plays a role in the integration of the beaches in South Jersey. Now, there's some debate about Washington and what her motives were. You know, she buys that elaborate house on the beach and forces it, right, the beachfront homes in Atlantic City to integrate. But she's seen as more on the conservative side by some historians. There's not enough written about her. We need more work about her life. And I came across her papers in the Atlantic City Public Library, in which they have a collection. I think some of those papers have been digitized. So if you want to know more about Sarah Spencer Washington, you should be able to look her up, Google her. It should take you right to the Atlantic City Free Public Library. They have a website with some images and some papers that have been digitized. But she was very active in the what I would argue she's very active in the struggle for Black equality and the organizing tradition that I just spoke about by using her wealth. She used her wealth and donated to several different causes, including charitable causes, just like CJ Walker does the same with her wealth, right? She lends her money to several different causes, right, for Black equality. Now, she doesn't take the same approach as others, maybe as Rosa Parks, right, took, but she did use her wealth, right, to advocate for freedom rights, Black freedom rights, I would argue. This is from the Sarah Spencer Washington collection at Atlantic City Free Public Library. If you can see that image close enough, you'll see she had offices in New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Philadelphia, New York, Newark, Richmond, Brooklyn, Washington, Baltimore, and Atlantic City. She also had is her business extended. It was a global empire, really. And she had connections in South Africa as well. Uh, Apex included beauty colleges, a publishing company, Apex News and Hair Co., laboratories, factories, and Apex Drug Co. On the left, you see an image of her, right? She was also an advocate of women's empowerment, and she wrote her own copy into the advertisements for Apex. And if you look at these advertisements in these pamphlets, you do see messages of women's empowerment. And one of her slogans was, "Now is the time to plan for your future." And she's particularly speaking to women. You can't see the text of this, but this is from one of these Apex pamphlets where you see a graduating class of women. And here it says, learn a profession, right? You have the ability to make an independent living, right? Here is your opportunity. Take immediate advantage. What she writes into these advertisements is, a sort of advocacy to women that you don't need to rely on a man to take care of you. You can establish your own business and create your own wealth. And she famously, when she remarried, she marries more than once. When she remarried, she famously, for over a year, did not tell people that she remarried. So she does have this, keen interest in, right, this message of women's empowerment that she does right into the advertisement for Apex. So this is just an image of where she can learn a profession. You can do it for yourself. This is a image of Apex Beauty School, once again from the Atlantic City Free Public Library collection of Sarah Spencer, Washington. So she's in Atlantic City, South Jersey, advocating for Black freedom rights and moving through these different organizations and associations and lending her money to different causes to support the Black community. Here is an image of her again. And one of her famous slogans, now is the time to plan for your future, right? Where she's on the golf course, right? So she was very active and centered in South Jersey, but presided over a global empire. Anna Arnold Hedgeman, who was a member and administrator with the YWCA. She was devoutly religious and a Methodist. I write about her as being active in New Jersey, but she's also active in New York. And New Jersey and New York are two of the first northern states to pass any sort of fair employment practices laws, FEPC laws, before any other state in the country. New Jersey and New York passes laws within a month of one another concerning equal access to jobs. And I make the argument that it's because of Anna Arnold Hedgeman, who was an organizer with the YWCA in the 1920s. She disguised herself as a washerwoman and was trying to organize the Black washerwomen in Jersey City. The YWCA at the time, they were not particularly interested in labor activism. Hedgeman was. And she eventually leaves Jersey City for New York, the famous, right, Black YWCA in Harlem. She goes to work there, but she was increasingly frustrated by the race politics of the YWCA. And when she had to travel for the YWCA, she was forced to stay in segregated hotels and constantly pushing the YWCA to become more progressive on issues of race. She eventually leaves, right, the organization, but was very active in the National Council of Churches, the NAACP, A. Philip Randolph, the Black labor leader that we know, Brother, Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, we know his story. They meet, in the course of her labor activism. And when Randolph is organizing a march on Washington during World War II, he taps Anna Arnold Hedgeman and he says, I want you to help me because you're one of the best known organizers. And she agreed. So she had all these contacts and played a role in the March on Washington movement, right? Randolph decides not to stage the March on Washington in the 1940s, but it was to put pressure on Franklin Roosevelt to force equal access to jobs in the defense industries. When the March on Washington is eventually organized in the 60s, where King gives his famous speech that we all know, A. Philip Randolph was the architect of that. And when he looks for somebody, a representation of women on that committee to organize the March on Washington 1960s, he calls for Anna Arnold Hedgeman. And it's been said by historians, right? Like Jennifer Scanlon wrote this book about Anna Arnold Hedgeman, Until There Is Justice. And I recommend that you pick it up if you're interested in women in the civil rights movement. It is the first major biography of Hedgeman. And she talked about the fact that Randolph wants Hedgeman on that committee because he said she's the only one that could bring together an interracial group of folks that would rival what we tried to do in the 40s. Quarter of a million people. And she gets credited with that through her contacts and the NAACP, her work on the Fair Employment Practices Committee, her work through the National Council of Churches, which was to bring, right, all these church organizations together across racial and class lines, that without her, you wouldn't have all those people on the lawn in the March on Washington. So she's active in New Jersey first and then New York, and I see her as kind of a transitional figure, right? She lives to be nearly 100 years old. She's active throughout the 20th century. And she's a woman that hardly anybody knows. The only woman on the committee to organize the March on Washington with an official role. There's a famous picture of her sitting with Randolph, organizing, sitting in front of a map, organizing the March on Washington. The last woman I profile in my book, the last chapter, discusses Marion Thompson Wright, born and raised in northern New Jersey in Montclair, where she kept a home. She was educated at first Howard University in Washington, D.C., historically black college. She returns to New Jersey briefly with her second husband and, starts to take courses at Columbia University Teachers College where she would earn her Ph.D. She was a social scientist and a historian, very active in the NAACP, and a scholar who wrote The Education of Negroes in New Jersey, in which she exposed patterns of segregation in the state, despite laws against, right, official segregation. She found in historical research that it was happening anyway. And so her research becomes the basis for a series of legal cases in New Jersey and eventually the Brown case. When we talk about civil rights movement, we often look to Brown versus Board of Education. But an important case, again, those of you who have an interest in New Jersey history, you know about Hedgepeth Williams versus the Trenton Board of Education, which predates Brown by 10 years. And it became possible for the NAACP to argue this case in New Jersey State Court because of the work that was done by Marion Thompson Wright. These are some images from Pepperdine University. Again, you can Google Marion Thompson Wright, Marion Thompson Wright's papers, sitting at Pepperdine Special Collections and University and Archives. But you will come across some of her letters, which you can read for yourself, her correspondence to her children. She has, in a lot of ways, a sad life, right? She's forced to leave high school at a very young age. She gets married, has two kids before, by the time she's 18 years old, had to drop out of school. It was her mother who insisted that she return to school and to get her degree. She went to the famous Barringer High School in Newark and did very well. Was a very smart student. And she wanted to go to college, but she had the two children. It was frowned upon at the time for teenage, poor teenage mother, right, to attend college. And so she ended up walking away from her first marriage and her children, finished her high school education, earns a scholarship to Howard, where she gets her master's degree and her BA degree, and eventually her PhD from Columbia. The letters that you will be able to read at Pepperdine, because I believe Pepperdine has made the images and letters open to the public and they're digital. You will read her writing to her son, admonishing her son not to call her mother because she was petrified that somebody at Howard would find out that she actually had kids, right? At the time, Mordecai Johnson, very conservative leader of Howard University at the time, right? She was scared somebody would read those letters and find out she actually had those kids. And Graham Russell Hodges has written, an extensive 70-page biography of her life. The first major biography of her appears in the Marion Thompson Wright Reader, which is a collection of her writings. So she was a scholar, a writer, researcher. She gets tapped by the NAACP to help with the Brown case. And the reason they looked for her to help them with the research on that case was of the work she did at Columbia University as a student. And that eventually Columbia would publish her findings about segregation in the state of New Jersey. These are some images of Marion Thompson Wright again with her son, Jimmy. Eventually becomes a scholar himself, scholar and professor. And on the right, Marion Thompson Wright with her mother, who encouraged her to continue her education, realizing how smart her daughter was. She really pushed and encouraged her to finish. Her work that she does at Columbia, in part, gets used in NAACP cases around segregation, ending segregation in the school systems. So Hedgepeth Williams versus Trenton Board of Education was decided at the state Supreme Court level in New Jersey, and the only such case before Brown involving black children K through 12, wherein the Supreme Court of New Jersey says it's unconstitutional. You cannot allow, right, segregation in the schools. In Trenton, blacks and whites, black children and white children were segregated in the middle schools. And these two mothers said, well, this school over here that the white kids go to, we should be able to send our kids there. And they weren't allowed. So they take their case to Robert Queen, NAACP lawyer. He takes that case to the New Jersey State Supreme Court level. And the New Jersey Supreme Court declares that, right, it's unconstitutional. Thurgood Marshall was directly interested in corresponding with Robert Queen, which I write about in my book. And he's saying, we will support you, Mr. Queen. This is going to be a test case for what could happen in the nation. And thus, the civil rights movement starts in New Jersey, if we think about it as starting with this desegregation of schools. This is Robert Queen in the middle and the two mothers, Gladys and Berlin, right? Gladys Hedgepeth and Berlin Williams and their children. And this is from New Jersey Afro-American 1944 image. So that's 10 years before Brown, right? And the Hedgepeth Williams Middle School eventually gets named after the two mothers. Rachel Devlin, in her book, A Girl Stands at the Door, talks about how women and girls are at the forefront of even the Brown cases. So there's many historians have talked about the centrality of women in the civil rights movement in different locales across the nation. I build on that analysis by looking at New Jersey as a case study. What then happens after this important case? The New Jersey Constitution, you all know, New Jersey gets a new constitution in 1947, forbidding segregation in uh, jobs, in public places, and in schools. And you could go and read the text of this, right? You can look up New Jersey Constitution 1947. This is an excerpt from New Jersey State Library that you can't really see. But no person shall be denied the employment based on their race, right? That's a blueprint for the nation. The NAACP papers reveal how much the NAACP was interested in what was going on in New Jersey. And Thurgood Marshall makes that clear in his letters to Robert Queen, right? That New Jersey was to be a test state for the nation. Does this Constitution end racism in New Jersey? No, right? Wall Township, right? We know there's a long history of the Klan in New Jersey, Klan activity right in Monmouth County where I live, right? Throughout much of the 20th century. And this was from 1948. This was written up in the local newspapers, but it also made national news when a cross was burned on the yard of a man, Leo Hudson, who what Leroy Hudson, who was an engineer, right? Um, and if you know, remember Fort Monmouth and everything, we know that a contingent of black engineers worked out of that area, but they were met with violence and intimidation when they lived, in Monmouth County and tried to, right, buy homes and things like that. But you can look this ad up to Wall Township cross burning 1948. Hudson calls members of the NAACP, what was then the Asbury Park NAACP, and several members showed up at his home, and they came locked and loaded with their guns, and they patrolled his home and said, "We're not going to have any more cross burnings," right? And so the struggle for black equality and the willingness to take up arms as well was happening in New Jersey before it was happening with the Black Panthers in the 60s, right? And they were members of the NAACP. This is a famous picture, New Jersey Civil Rights Act of 1949, famous picture wherein uh, you see mostly males here, but you also see right one of the representatives of Black women's clubs at the signing. And New Jersey has this Civil Rights Act in 1949. It has a new constitution in 1947 that calls for the ending of discrimination in public places before the nation, 20 years before these things happen in the nation. Okay. The blueprint, Luther King said civil rights number one, access voting, civil rights number two, access to public places. And those things were happening by law in New Jersey, a northern state. And why Thurgood Marshall and before him, James Weldon Johnson, said New Jersey will be a test state for the nation. And so, in which black women play a critical and key roles. This continues today with Latasha Brown, Stacey Abrams, the New Georgia Project, Fair Fight, Black Voters Matter, the central role that black women continue to play in both local and national politics, continue down to the present. The civil rights movement uh, was led by women and it began in the Garden State. These are just some of my sources. If anyone's interested in sort of investigating further some of the stories that I mentioned in the Sarah Spencer Washington collection at Lang City Public Library, Kruger Scott African American Oral History Collection, Marion Thompson Wright's papers. Again, Pepperdine University has digitized these, and you should be able to go right to their website and take a look at those papers. Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, various collections of the NAACP papers, where you can actually read Thurgood Marshall talking about New Jersey as an important test state. And then very many, I love my libraries, and I just want to thank the organizers of this event tonight. And much of my work was done using resources from the public library, the oral history projects that these local librarians have done. And you can now access many of these collections. So I want to thank you all tonight for joining me and including the members of the Morris County Library for inviting me tonight. And there's probably a few minutes for questions. I want to see if I can stop my share, if that's making sense here.
All right. Hello again.
Hi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams.
Mm-hmm.
I am going to pin you as the speaker. We do have a couple of questions that were in the chat. If anybody else wants to ask a question in the chat, you can type it there, um, or you could raise your hand and we'll unmute you. So let's see. Jean asked if we could get a reading list of books. Now I see that you had a page of sources towards the end of your presentation, so there is that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any ideas on a reading list for this topic?
So some of the books that I mentioned, at the dark end of the street, the images are in the slides,
Okay.
and that's it. That's a good book. Betty Adams, her book, you know, Christian activism, Black women and Christian activism in New Jersey,
Mm-hmm.
is another good book specifically about New Jersey. But in terms of, there's so many books written about the role of women in the civil rights movement, Black women in particular.
Mm-hmm.
I could certainly send you, some more sources.
That would be great. That would be great, and I will share it with our community here. Our
Mhm.
second question is from Kevin, and he asks, what do you think lies ahead for this movement? What do you
Yeah,
think will be
so
the
I
next
mean, like I
steps?
said, oh, sorry, like I said, the struggle for Black equality has always been ongoing. Um, again with that song, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest." Democracy has to always be renewed in order to stay alive. We have to be critical of our leaders in order for democracy to survive. So we have to remember that democracy is an idea that we strive for. We have to keep striving for that idea if we want to keep, the flame of freedom alive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the struggle for Black equality represents that. It's African Americans that call the nation to conscience
Mm-hmm.
again and again.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to give people a chance to either formulate something to share and raise their hand or to type something in the comments. But in the meantime, I will remind people that because of the technical difficulties, Dr. Williams has agreed for us to record this Zoom tonight. And it'll probably take a day to just edit it, tidy up the beginning and the end. And then I will post a link on our social media, and I will also include the link to in the original event listing. So even though you'll see that the event passed, if that's how you found us, if that's easy for you to get to, you don't use social media, I'll add the link to that event listing tomorrow, Thursday at the very latest. And then I did copy down emails for the folks who did register with the new meeting code. So I will send it to those folks as well. Okay, and I do want to say we had people, I could see them clapping for you, muted but clapping for you. So thank you very much for your presentation. It looks like that is it for questions. Did you have any parting words for us, Dr. Williams?
I would say, again, like I said about democracy, we have to continue to be critical of our leaders
Mm-hmm.
in order to keep democracy alive. And it's really, I think, the Black freedom struggle that shows us this and how
Mm-hmm.
it's to be done.
Mm-hmm.
And so read more about African American history, not just the civil rights movement, but more generally.
Mm-hmm. And criticism, it's some people think it's a negative just by the sound of the word or perhaps their experience with it, but criticism is important and necessary. It's
Hmm.
just constant evaluation, pretty much.
Hmm.
All right.
Sure.
All right, great. Thank you all so much. Thank you, attendees and Dr. Williams, for your patience
Sure.
in getting this show rolling tonight. And look for a link to our YouTube channel the next day or so. And thank you, Dr. Williams, for presenting.
Sure. Thank you
And
for
we,
having me.
You're quite welcome. And you can find her book at the Morris County Library, The Georgia of the North. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
You too.